So I'd like to discuss a deep dive regarding an 1860 inquiry that was ordered by the government of Napoleon III with regard to metallurgical imports from England. And this revolved around a treaty that they were crafting with England at the time. And the purpose of this inquiry was to establish whether various tariffs with regards to these metals could be retained, raised, lowered, etc. And this is quite fascinating from this angle of watchmaking with regards to the materials used for these various industries in watchmaking and watchmaking, the parts that go into this. So now the government of Napoleon III, this was in 1860, sent out a questionnaire to various different industrials with regards to a series of questions revolving around these tariffs on steel and other metal products. Now this was answered by industrials. These are individuals engaged in industry in France, and in particular anything to do with steel, metal usage, machine tool production, etc. And we have a lot of interesting individuals attending this, and we have the Society for Watchmaking involved, as well as the Montandon Frères spring and clock watch and clock spring manufacturers. Now this is very interesting, their part in this, because we know prior to this, in 1852, at the Paris exhibition, when they were recognized, they were showing their springs at this Paris exhibition, and it is interesting that they're noted as that the quality of their springs was very high, and their establishment was the most considerable of this genre of industry in all of France. And indeed, 90% of their production went around the world. They were the largest spring manufacturer in France and the world. And this would be only increasing after 1852. Certainly by 1860, they were already working under steam. Their machine tools were powered by steam, and they had quite interesting setup, and this would only increase as time went by. This is also interesting, this 1860. Now it should be remembered that watchmaking in France had pretty much died down. In fact, the last remaining watchmaking center was in Besançon, where factories were still continuing to produce watches. However, Switzerland was on the high horse. They were still the number one for watch manufacturing. This was slowly eroding, so that we know that by 1876, at the Philadelphia exhibition in the United States, that the United States revealed its achievements, and that it was vastly overtaking the Swiss industry in watchmaking. And this was rather interesting. Now we find ourselves in this period, this 1860 to 1876 period. Switzerland is still number one. France as a watchmaker had declined, and we know that Switzerland was slowly giving ground to the American mass production, and they were able to still maintain this number one place at this time. However, this is a very interesting backdrop. So let us look at some of these questions posed by the ministers and this committee that were asking, basically, in a sense, they had sent this questionnaire. We do have a product range here which is being discussed, and for Montandon Frères, this was they only had two products, and this was clock and watch springs. And this was large-scale production for clock movements, chronometers, precision instruments. They created these various different gauges for measuring this watch springs, etc. So manufacturing processes and raw materials differ between the two. With raw materials, we're speaking of English cast steel, and this was rolled steel for watch springs. And the cost of this was 650 francs per 100 kilos in France. Now, in England, if they were importing English steel, the price was 370 francs, plus 125 francs import duties, totaling 495 francs at a cost. So this is still like 85 francs cheaper to import steel even with the tariffs, which is rather fascinating. Now, they had previously used Styrian wrought steel from Austria. This was rolled for clock springs. The cost was 560 francs per 100 kilos in France. Now, as far as the pricing on watch springs wholesale, this was 1,600 francs per 100 kilos. And clock springs wholesale pricing at 800 francs per 100 kilos of material. So their energy was being produced using Belgian coal, and this was 34 francs per 1,000 kilos of steel. And now they did use locally sourced charcoal at 2.75 francs per hectoliter. Their production infrastructure was an 8 horsepower steam engine, which powered their factory, and they had 20 machine tools in use. And this was in 1860. So this does tell you this would only increase. But let us look at some of our export markets. Now, export markets, as I mentioned previously, 90% of the products were exported to England, to America, Switzerland, Holland, Germany, Italy, and Russia. So only 10% of their production was sold domestically in France. And as far as competitiveness, French products were at this time superior in precision, but faced cost disadvantages, as we see based on the answers given in these questions to the inquiry, the inquest. So, but these were due to higher duties and raw material costs. English benefits from duty-free coal and steel were there, and Switzerland had very low customs duties, as was noted. Now, import duties regarding watchmaking supplies in France was 5 francs per kilogram. Imported English rolled steel was 1.25 francs per kilogram. Now, they were able to realize added value on the products. For clock springs, the raw material cost was 560 francs per 100 kilos. The finished products were sold at 800 francs. They were adding, on average, between 240 to 260 francs of value added by making these springs from the steel. Now, the processes included rolling, softening, and polishing. And it was in the polishing, incidentally, where the precision came in. Now, the raw material format, they used this English steel, which they preferred, and this arrived in long strips of 10 to 20 meters in length, with varying thicknesses between 0.5 to 0.05 to 0.2 millimeters. Now, bars were also utilized, but however, these were much more costly to process than the sheets were, so they preferred sheets. Now, production scale, we're talking about between clock and watch springs. Montandon Frères Paris and Rambouillet were utilizing 30,000 kilos annually. This was 18 to 20,000 kilos for large scale horology, and 10,000 kilos for small watchmaking, in other words, watch springs themselves. The annual output was 100,000 to 120,000 clock springs versus 110,000 to 150,000 dozen watch springs. This was per year, and this was in 1860, and this would only explode as their production became even more and more efficient. They increased the type of machine tools that they were using, and they learned how to get more from the equipment and make improvements along the way. Now, foreign competition. French manufacturers preferred sheet steel over bar steel for efficiency. Rolling steel in France increased the cost by 85 francs per 100 kilos. There was this duty-free advantage. By removing duties on English steel and coal, this would have given French manufacturers a competitive edge. This is incidentally what Montandon Frères was fighting for. Now, the individual that was participating on this inquiry, this was most likely Louis Francois. Louis Montandon from Montandon Frères, he was the senior of the two brothers. Abraham Henry was the other brother. He would, after the death of Louis in 1875, he would continue to manage the business up until at least around 1880. By 1880, we know that his son, Alfred, was already handling the business. And this is Alfred Henry. So now let us continue about the economic impact. Now, lowering import duties on the rolled steel would have significantly enhanced French competitiveness, and this is sort of where they were going with this. Switzerland sourced raw materials from England, and they had a duty of only 4 francs per 100 kilos. So we see the differences here. There were domestic challenges. French steel was softer, and it was prone to breaking. So this was an issue, and domestic rolling was more costly to work with. Now, there was advocacy against the duties. Now, certainly they were happy to keep the duties in place and not that they be raised. But when asked whether these duties, would it be helpful to have these duties removed, they were certainly in favor of this. This would have given them a significant benefit for their own production. Production cost details. Rolling steel externally, this was outside of their house, it was more economical for Montandon Frères than in-house processing. Now, originally they were processing the steel for these springs in-house. However, later they deemed that it was much more effective to have this done to outsource this, basically. Now, differences in steel format affected yield and costs, and 900 springs from a sheet of steel could be obtained versus 200 to 250 from barred or steel bars. Now, French watchmaking at this period was in decline, and it was basically at a minimum at this point compared with Switzerland. Now, Besançon was the only remaining sort of factory or center of this watchmaking in France at this point. It had all evaporated. So, policy recommendations. Basically, they were advocating reduced duties on imported raw materials like rolled steel and coal. There was a suggestion no additional duties be placed on foreign products. The market dynamic. Finished watch production in France struggled against Swiss competition due to the lower duties, as previously mentioned, and the streamlined supply chains enjoyed in Switzerland. Now, it was already mentioned that Switzerland was the big watch supplier, and France was basically not in the watch production. However, Montandon Frères had a very interesting situation here. They were producing the watch parts used by watchmakers, and it is interesting in that at the end they were asked about the duties for watches, and their answer was rather interestingly politically correct. They sort of deferred the question because they only produced watch springs, and the watch production itself was not what they were involved in. And this is very interesting. This confirms a lot of things that they were only doing the watch springs at this point, and they had absolutely nothing to do with watchmaking at this point. Now Montandon Frères was making watches for them. So there's a sort of a fine line here that they probably had retained incomes, because this was basically a business divided into two branches, and the Swiss branch was making watches. There was activity in Besançon and in Geneva, and these probably they were probably making they were also outsourced for watches, and they did probably have a revenue from that, because this was all part of the same industry basically as Montandon Frères, Locle, and Paris. But they had these workshops that did work for them, and it was rather fascinating. So this guarded answer may also tell us a little bit about, there's a suggestion actually in my mind that they were still retaining this revenue from the watches, even though they were only involved there. This chief business in France was only involved in the watch spring production and clock spring actually. But let us continue with the conclusion. Now Montandon, this is probably Louis Montandon who would have been in attendance here, believed that French manufacturers could compete internationally if raw materials duties were reduced, emphasizing the need for policy adjustments to address structural disadvantages. This is more or less what the government was after. They wanted to fine-tune basically the French manufacturing position in the world, and help, in other words, to determine which way would suit the producers most efficiently. So there's some interesting insight that we can add to this. There were strategic preferences here. Now Montandon was specifically highlighting the benefits of sheet steel over bar steel, emphasizing the efficiency and higher output of springs from sheets versus the bars. Their economic prioritization here, Montandon prioritized economic benefit over protectionism, advocating for free trade in raw materials like steel and coal to improve competitiveness. This is what they were after. Industry comparisons. The testimony contrasted French and Swiss watchmaking industries with Switzerland's advantage in raw material imports and duties, lower duties highlighted as key factors in their dominance. Technological observations. Despite higher cost, Montandon acknowledged that French steel rolling is technically proficient but economically less viable compared to import alternatives. We see this today. It's quite fascinating. Geographic challenges. France's domestic resource constraints, such as higher rolling costs and less effective local steels, were underscored as barriers to competitiveness. Now, as far as production process efficiencies, by outsourcing rolling, Montandon Frères demonstrated a pragmatic approach to cost management, and this aligned with their overall strategy to compete globally. And we see that they did this quite well, that their springs were sold around the world, and they were the largest and highest quality manufacturer of these clock and watch springs. This dominance would last until almost the turn of the century, when certainly it had started to become overtaken by American and other producers, and the aging of the owners with in line with other changes that were happening. But quantifiable impact. The substantial annual steel consumption between 28,000 to 30,000 kilograms underlined the importance of duty reductions for operational sustainability and cost competitiveness. And this is quite fascinating when you think about the amount of tariff on 30,000 kilos of steel, which they're using annually. This is an incredibly staggering amount, which could have been rechanneled into their business had this been in place earlier. However, this is the reason why the government was very attuned to evaluating this situation. So potential for growth. If duty-free imports were allowed, then there were the potential for France to not only sustain but expand its presence in global markets, especially in precision watch components, would have been in place. Policy stance consistency. Montandon's testimony consistently supported open market policies, rejecting protectionism measures, and it was in favor of leveraging France's industrial precision and quality. So these are quite important points to focus on now. Market demand insights. The significant export figures, 90% of their production, reflected strong international demand for French precision watch springs, and this reinforced the importance of competitive pricing. Now, the sectoral decline indicators were addressed. This was the discussion about the decline of French watchmaking, with Besançon as the only surviving watch factory, basically. And this provided a critical context about the industry's challenges and the need for structural reforms to the government. The pragmatic policy suggestions made by Montandon provided actionable recommendations, such as duty reductions on rolled steel and coal, aligning with broader industrial needs for cost-effective manufacturing. Global market dynamics. The testimony highlighted global pricing parity for precision springs, suggesting that France's competitiveness, or competitive advantage rather, lie in quality rather than cost. Future-proofing. Now, Montandon Frères' openness to competition and willingness to adapt and underline a forward thinking approach. This forward-thinking approach is quite important in aiming to sustain and grow France's industrial relevance in watchmaking components. And this is a very powerful theme. We're seeing this before, a decade before the Americans were able to really get into this. The Americans were still not there. So they were at the right time, at the right place, doing the right things. However, we would see later that the sheer size of the American nation and the power, the amount of economic capital that they were able to concentrate on these issues would change the tide. But they were doing everything correctly. And this is very sort of promising to see these types of inquests, such as what the Napoleon III's government was attempting to position themselves to be in the best possible world. So this was just a very brief discussion about this 1860 inquest by the French government on metallurgical tariffs and duties, and I hope this provided some insight as to this quite fascinating industry in watchmaking. Indeed, this company of Montandon Frères Paris, we have to remember that they were on top. They were the top dog in this, and there were almost no competitors on the scale that they were on for the longest time. That they literally a generation. If they were, they had fought their way to the top, and their excellence allowed them to be the top clock and watch spring manufacturer for over a generation. This is over 25 years easily, because they were making big waves in the 1840s. By the 1850s, they were already recognized as the most substantial, the largest producer in France, and this would only expand very powerfully up into the 1880s. So this is an interesting company. I want to bring more focus to this company, because the history is very unappreciated and really forgotten. So I hope this was of interest, and I really would appreciate any questions that you might have regarding this matter, and I wish you a very nice evening. Thank you for your attention, and adieu.